Okay, welcome everybody to our program tonight. I'm Ed Friedman. I chair Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. This is the fourth program in this season's winter Zoom speaker series, our 28th year, I believe, doing this. So yeah, we're a very unique organization in that we take a holistic look at the environment in Merrymeeting Bay area and beyond the bay. As you can see, we sort of focus on these four different areas here. Little page on each. This is a little bit dated. We've used the freshwater mussels to determine whether or not the paper mills, pulp mills are still discharging dioxin or not when they change their processes. We've got an incredible circulation study over multiple years. It's on the web. It's animated. It's very cool. Still doing a lot of eagle work every year. Longest running eagle nest survey in the state. Eagle and nests and chicks. And we're doing a lot of work with PFAS in the last few years, particularly as it relates to the former Naval Air Station and the lower Merrymeeting Bay watershed. So the Androscoggin up to Auburn-Lewiston and the Kennebec up to Augusta. A lot of our advocacy work focuses on fish passage. And for those of you that don't know, the first dam on the Androscoggin in Brunswick is up for relicensing in 2029, and that process has started. And we're working with a number of colleagues to ensure that either the dam goes away or fish passage is improved substantially, because right now that's actually horrible fish passage, and pretty typical as we've been counting using underwater sonar, counting shad each year, each spring for a number of years now, and it's we're seeing on the upwards of 10,000 shad come up on one tide trying to get to the fishway and get up the dam. And typically for the season, that dam is passing anywhere from 13 to 50 shad, versus the 10,000 that are trying to get there. So that's pretty typical. They don't do well on alewives or river herring as well. We have an active education program, a little less active than it was. We haven't been going into schools that much because of COVID and post-COVID stuff, but we're back to doing our Bay Days, which are twice a year, getting kids outside away from digital devices and doing good hands-on stuff like you see pictures of here, and they love it. And it's very rewarding when a student says, "I don't want to stop for lunch. I want to be an archaeologist." And we've protected over 1,500 acres of land by now. Our focus being on valuable wildlife habitat as opposed to recreational. Hearing a voice, I don't know who that was, but people should be muted, except for myself and Martin and Barbara. And yeah, if you like the program tonight or want to see some other ones on our homepage, which is f1b.org or friendsofmerrymeetingbay.org, scroll down the right side and look under education, and you'll see a speaker series video list there. You can find, I don't know, 10 years or so of these have been recorded. You can find them there. You can see our current calendars. Well, we're going to see it in a minute, but it's there. And so the archives as well. So there's a few ways to get to this video and other videos. Here's the season calendar. We were just talking before the program about, there's a piece on the radio today about green crabs on the West Coast and how sea otters may be really useful in knocking their populations down. We don't have any more otters in the Atlantic Ocean anymore like we used to. So we need to come up with other things to do with them. And our next speaker will have some good ideas about that, I know. And if you're interested in Rachel Carson, which you are, because otherwise you wouldn't be here, I really want to highlight the March program, Rosalie Edge, conservation, early grassroots conservationist, very few people have heard of, but was really, really, really important in protecting a lot of land and setting aside Olympic National Park and protecting parts of Yosemite and in protecting Hawk Mountain down in Pennsylvania. And the data that she collected down in Hawk Mountain of the raptors going by there, which were getting shot before she ended up owning the mountain, formed a basis or part of the basis for Rachel Carson's work on Silent Spring some years later. So With that, I'm going to introduce Barbara Vickery, our speaker tonight. After serving as a rare plant botanist with the Maine Critical Areas Program, Barbara joined the staff of the Nature Conservancy in Maine in 1983 as their Director of Science and Stewardship. She later served as Director of Conservation Programs until she retired in 2017. After his death, she worked with a team to edit her husband, Peter Vickery's life work, Birds of Maine, highly recommended, published in 2020. Barbara now serves on the Maine, Barbara's playing with the screen, someone is, now serves on the Maine Board of Environmental Protection and Forest Society of Maine Board, as an active member of the Citizens Climate Lobby Midcoast Maine chapter, and is a member of 6 local organizations, including Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, who have helped conserve trails she uses regularly. There you go. Okay.
Sorry about that, folks. When I was asked to give a talk about Rachel Carson last year, this is my second time around, but it's a little different. I was really honored because I'd always been an admirer. And when anybody asked me who my heroes were, I sometimes had to wonder, I don't go in for Wonder Woman, but I would usually end up saying Rachel Carson. But I was also humbled because I thought, I don't know that much about Rachel Carson, so I can't do her justice. My third thought was that I wanted to know her better. So what better way to do that than to do the homework I needed to do so I could share and tell other people about her. I had questions about how this woman, who had no PhD, no platform of university or government position or national organization from which to speak, had so much influence. Furthermore, as her photo seems to show, she was a retiring, modest person. How did she become the lightning rod of national scientific debates and the essential spark of the environmental movement? How I knew her best was as a conservationist. As you just heard, I spent most of my professional career working for the Maine chapter of the Nature Conservancy, of which Rachel Carson was a founding member. As she said to a group that gathered at the Wiscasset Inn in 1956 to share their concerns about what was happening to the Maine coast, what about the Nature Conservancy? It's the only group I know which is doing something practical about actually preserving areas. I'm happy to say that now, these many years later, there are lots of groups doing something practical like that, but at the time, she became the founding chair of this new chapter, only the 4th such in the country, and remained as honorary chair until her death. When I started at the Conservancy, I was responsible for taking care of some 75 preserves around the state, many of these along the coast. All of the coastal work was financially supported by Nature Conservancy's Rachel Carson Endowment. Where did the money come from? From the proceeds of her books, which she had left to the Conservancy in her will. So I knew she was a successful author because there were royalties continuing to accrue into that fund. Specifically, I knew a place she had spent a lot of time, for it was one of the preserves in my care, the Rachel Carson Salt Pond in Chamberlain. I hope you know it and that you've gone at low tide to enjoy those close looks at starfish and limpets and Irish moss. Whatever you can see, but it needs to be at low tide. It's hard to see it otherwise. The third way I knew about Rachel Carson had everything to do with bald eagles. The story of the comeback of eagles on the Maine coast after DDT was banned was iconic in the annals of conservation. TNC, when I began in 1983, was focused on helping IF&W bring back Maine's eagle population by protecting islands with nesting pairs. I was responsible for stewardship of a dozen such islands. That comeback was made possible, I knew, because Rachel Carson's book had led to the banning of DDT. But that's pretty much all I knew. So I set out to learn more. Some basic facts. She grew up poor in Springdale, Pennsylvania, steel and coal country outside Pittsburgh, but on a small farm with a woodlot where she spent a lot of time with her mother, who encouraged Rachel's natural instinct to observe closely, be curious, and enjoy the natural world. Rachel later wrote this, and it's clear to me that for her, that special someone was her mother. I'm interested that Rachel always uses he, even though she means he or she, but that's our modern interpretation. You just go with it. Don't worry about it. Rachel means the other half of the human race also. When she was an adult, she did her best to be that person for young people also. She went to the Pennsylvania College for Women, intending to major in English because she had always known she wanted to be a writer. But a general distribution requirement led her to take a course in biology from apparently a gifted teacher, and she was hooked and suddenly realized that this is what she wanted to write about. She switched her major to biology. She started a graduate program in marine biology at Johns Hopkins on a full scholarship. She had no experience of the sea growing up, but it was always drawn to it. She loved the summers at Woods Hole that were part of that graduate work. She would have liked to have gone on to pursue a PhD, but by this time it was the depths of the Depression. Her father had just died suddenly, and she needed a steady job to help support her mother, her sister, and two nieces. In 1936, she got a job as a biologist with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, which eventually was folded into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She started by writing a series of radio programs on marine life and creating pamphlets on ocean fish to encourage housewives to branch out in what seafood they offered their families. She moved on to conservation bulletins for each region and a series called Conservation in Action. But in a decade, she had gone from junior aquatic biologist to chief editor of all U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service publications, which meant general director of a publishing program with a staff of 6 assistants. Also ghostwriter for speeches and congressional testimony given by department officials. A fellow writer meeting for the first time in this period described her as quiet, diffident, without any affectation. As she got opportunities to explore more of the Atlantic coast, one who spent time in the field with her wrote, "We learned a great deal from her. Most of all, a way of seeing, alert to every impression, with keen delight in all manner of small creatures, as well as the vast horizons and far reaches." Meanwhile, she was still publishing her own work in magazines, which eventually led to invitations from publishers for full-length books about the sea. So, essential way of getting to know Rachel Carson is through her books, of course. I started with her first, Under the Sea Wind, which was not an instant success when published, but was her favorite, and now mine. In the last letters to Dorothy, of whom you'll hear about in a minute, she said that when she was settling for the night, she picked up Under the Sea Wind to help her fall asleep. I agree that it's a lovely book to go to bed with. What is different about this book as a piece of nature writing is that she doesn't so much tell us that eels migrate downstream or even invite us to observe from the shore adult eels migrating. She takes us into the water, invites those creatures to, in effect, tell us what they're seeing and sensing and feeling. And thus, we readers not only learn a lot about their life stories and habitats that we've not only never seen but rarely imagined, but we feel a connection and empathy with lives very different from our own. That sense of connection to all life is an essential through line in Rachel Carson's work. Her later works were no less imaginative, but relied more on direct observations, as well as meticulous library research. They continued to emphasize connections. In this next book, The Sea Around Us was far more successful. It was on the bestseller list for 86 weeks and won the National Book Award. Some people were surprised at the popularity of a work of science. Ms. Carson challenged the idea that science was something apart, or that science writing must be without poetry. Materials of science are the materials of life itself. The aim of science is to discover and illuminate the truth, and that, I take it, is the aim of literature. My purpose is to portray the sea with fidelity and understanding. I was writing as the subject demanded. If there is poetry in my book, it is not because I deliberately put it there, but because no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry. With the publication of The Sea Around Us, Rachel Carson became famous, had what today would be called a huge fan base. She was in demand for magazine or articles for Ladies' Home Journal to The Atlantic. Her books were condensed in Reader's Digest, offered as Book of the Month Club selections, translated into 37 languages. There was even a documentary movie made of the sea around us, although Carson hated their lurid perversion of her messages. But her fame helped her gain influence with people, non-scientists, and she began realizing that this gave her a platform she should use, not only to teach, but to preach. She won numerous awards, including the John Burroughs Award, and upon accepting it, she wrote, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe around us, the less taste we shall have for the destruction of our race. Wonder and humility do not exist side by side with a lust for destruction." Importantly, the financial success of the sea around us is what allowed Rachel Carson to quit her job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and devote herself full-time to writing. It also allowed her to purchase a small plot of land in Southport on the shores of Sheepshead Bay, where she built a cottage that was to become her favorite place. She brought her mother, her niece Marjorie, her sister having since died, and grandnephew Roger there each summer. The sea was yards from her doorstep. She could hear the tide coming in and going out through one window and hermit thrushes in the spruce woods behind her through another. An important side benefit of this new summer home was that it introduced her to Stanley and Dorothy Freeman, who had a summer cottage nearby. Dorothy wrote to Rachel welcoming her to the neighborhood and suggesting they meet. They formed an instant rapport. Dorothy and Stanley also loved exploring intertidal life, and Stanley was an excellent photographer whose photos of intertidal creatures Rachel would use in her presentations. Dorothy became Rachel's closest friend and an essential support through Rachel's later health issues and the uproar around Silent Spring. What Rachel especially treasured was that Dorothy alone, among all her friends, understood both her writing life and its trials, as well as the rest of her life. Her next book, The Edge of the Sea, in which she drew some of the most evocative passages from the tide pools at the salt pond and out her own door, was an equal success. I'm going to read you a little piece of it that I think gives you flavor. She's looking into an intertidal cave that is only accessible at very low tide. As I lie and look into the pool, there are moments of relative quiet in the intervals when one wave has receded, the next one has not yet entered. Then I can hear the small sounds, the sound of water dripping from the mussels on the ceiling, or of water dripping from seaweeds that line the walls, small silver splashes losing themselves in the vastness of the pool, and in the confused, murmurous whisperings that emanate from the pool itself. Then, as my fingers explore among the dark red thongs of the dulse and push away the fronds of the Irish moss that cover the walls, I begin to find creatures of such extreme delicacy that I wonder how they can exist in this cave when the brute force of storm surf is unleashed within its confined space. Well, you get the idea. I think she's a heck of a writer. She had ideas about what she wanted to write next, a vast, comprehensive book on the relation of life to the physical environment, tentatively titled no less than Man and Nature. For sure, she wanted to emphasize that all life is interrelated. But about this time, she got a letter from a woman describing the death of many songbirds following a spray of DDT over a nature preserve in a rural neighborhood. 7 robins dead in the letter writer's yard, all bees and grasshoppers gone, but mosquitoes as voracious as ever, and begging Rachel to find someone in Washington to help. This was a personal appeal. Carson felt that something had to be done. Someone needed to pull together the data and tell the world. She urged others to take it on. She begged E.B. White, fellow Maine writer and editor of The New Yorker, to write it. He said, "No, you need to write this book, and we will publish it in serial form," as they had done with Sea Around Us. She didn't want to write this book. She wanted to write about life in all its wondrous forms. She knew this would be a book about death. She referred to it as the poison book, but she felt she had to do something, and so she started in. She signed a contract for the book in 1958, estimating she would complete it in 7 months, but it soon became evident it was going to take much longer. For one thing, she knew it would be controversial. She was determined to make sure the science was ironclad. In addition, the more experts she consulted from around the world, the more evidence she found of the impacts of DDT and other pesticides, not only on insects, but on fish, on birds, on people. But then each news story needed to be fleshed out and painstakingly fact-checked. It wasn't that no one had documented issues with DDT before, but no one had pulled together widely scattered facts and considered them together. The other reason it took so long was that she suffered personal tragedy after personal tragedy, the deaths of her niece, and then which led to the adoption and care for her grandnephew Roger, the death of her mother, and on top of this, the return of metastasized breast cancer, a series of infections, a crippling flare-up of arthritis. And then there was the problem, the challenge of writing something people would actually pay attention to. It's a great problem to know how to penetrate the barrier of public indifference to unpleasant facts that might have to be dealt with if one recognized their existence. But knowing what I do, I have no choice but to set it down to be read by those who will. The fact that more than 2 million copies of Silent Spring sold, and it sparked a generation of activists, suggests that she had penetrated the barrier of indifference. I had never read Silent Spring and frankly dreaded doing so for the same reasons Rachel didn't want to write it. It's much more enjoyable to read her lyrical accounts of life in the sea, but I found it to be highly readable and suddenly realized why it was a bestseller despite its grim topic. She's an extraordinary explainer of science for laypeople. I experienced the satisfaction of understanding. I was taken, for instance, with her explanation of mitochondria. The enduring, persistent impulse of life is dependent on the intricate workings of energy generation in tiny parts of every cell, in the mitochondria, which have been in living cells since the beginning of life. I remember being required to memorize the Krebs cycle when I was in biology. I found it very challenging and it didn't stick with me. But here's what I remember that Rachel Carson made clear in the book. It's a cycle. Each step is dependent on a specific enzyme. Those are the numbered, the numbered chemicals in, or substances in the going around the circle. Each one is a different enzyme. And if the problem is that chemicals introduced, invented by humans, never known to life forms before, often altered those enzymes, causing cascading, far-reaching, profound harms. It's a powerful concept. I encourage you to read the book because she explained it better than I do. She tells the story of the dramatic decline of bald eagles on the Gulf Coast, as well as Gulf of Maine, but also of Clear Lake in California, where spraying to eliminate harmless but annoying gnats led to the elimination of nesting grebes, who had eaten fish, which had eaten aquatic bugs, which had eaten aquatic plants, all of which were packed with high concentrations of DDT, even after the water itself seemed to have no DDT left in it. I was concerned when I heard about this because I really like grebes. So I wanted to make sure that the grebes are back in that lake. So I looked it up and I'm happy to say they are now that DDT was banned some years ago. She also tells the sad story of Midwestern towns trying to save their elms dying of Dutch elm disease by spraying DDT to kill the insects transmitting the fungal disease, only to find dead robins littering lawns the following spring. Robins that had eaten worms, that had eaten fallen elm leaves, that had been sprayed the year before. Her stories vividly drive home crucial lessons of ecosystem-wide effects via bioaccumulation, the pernicious power of small doses accumulating and flowing through food webs. She also used the subtle but lethal impacts of radiation from nuclear material as an analogy to chemicals, knowing the public in 1960 was now all too aware of the dangers of radioactivity. The other reason that Silent Spring is not such grim reading is that every turn she can, she offers alternatives, describing, for instance, how towns in New York had saved many of their elms, not through spraying pesticides, but by rigorous forest hygiene, picking up and removing all the diseased leaves and wood and preventing further spread of the blight from tree to tree. All the more compelling since the insecticides were not working anyway. When the book was finally completed, and she had gotten a positive reaction from the New Yorker editor, suddenly the tension of the last 4 years was broken. And I let the tears come, she said. I said last summer that I could never again listen happily to a thrush song if I had not done all I could. And last night, the thought of all the birds and other creatures, all the liveliness that is in nature, came to me with such a surge of deep happiness that now I have done what I could. I have been able to complete it, and now it has its own life. There was concern expressed that the attack on DDT would lead to widespread deaths in Africa, where it was used effectively to control mosquitoes carrying malaria. In fact, she never proposed a ban on DDT. DDT had been developed for use against malaria-carrying mosquitoes during the war. It had never been imagined for, let alone tested for safety, for broadcast applications in suburbia or large-scale agriculture. When it was finally on its way to publication, but had yet to come out in the Advanced New Yorker series, 3 chemical companies threatened to sue the publisher if the book were published, saying that Carson was in league with sinister anti-American parties, in those days code for communist. When the suit was dropped as groundless, they mounted a concerted media campaign. See if some of these attacks sound familiar. A bird and bunny lover who keeps cats. Hysterically. So that old trope. The criticisms drew on widespread prejudice against women scientists. The Time magazine review said that Carson's emotional and accurate outburst was hysterically emphatic. Note how their acknowledgement of the accuracy is completely sabotaged by words like emotional and hysterical. When she was preparing to speak to a local community group organizing against spraying in the neighborhood, one of the town fathers called to tell her she was an alarmist. When she started citing case histories, he said, "You really must not believe everything you read in the newspapers." She was furious. She wasn't a PhD, but she was a scientist who relied on verified fact. No one seeing her response that afternoon could have called her gentle, a friend wrote. But her anger was not about her own ego. It was about her desperate desire to penetrate that barrier of indifference. She had become an unabashed advocate, a crusader. Silent Spring represented a threat not only to the pesticide industry, small but wealthy group of companies, but also the prevalent societal attitude that nature was something that had to be dominated and controlled by humans. She felt we should control ourselves. In any case, the science was sound. Rachel Carson had earned the trust of her readers, and housewives, local citizens groups were concerned. Thousands of people wrote letters to the editors of their papers, to their political representatives. Part of the awakening was not just that pesticides were pervasive and pernicious, but the realization that an essential unspoken trust had been broken, the assumption that someone was making sure they were safe before allowing their use without people's knowledge or permission. But she posed the question, who's making those decisions? Who gets to decide between crops and monarchs? Who has the right to invade my property with poisons without my permission or knowledge? The lost innocence and its consequences, the realization that people have to take personal responsibility for finding out, paying attention, taking action, was part of what then sparked the environmental movement. A year after the publication, a massive fish kill in the Mississippi was confirmed to be linked to a major stockpile of pesticides on the banks of the river. The public and the public media took notice and connected the dots. She was interviewed on CBS Sunday Morning by Eric Sevareid. It was set up as a debate. The consensus was that Rachel Carson won. Some people have noticed that her hair looks different in these slides. Consider this. She's undergoing treatment for cancer this whole time. She had lost all her hair. That's a wig. She and Dorothy called it the Betty. But for any of you who have undergone chemotherapy yourselves or sat with a loved one who has, imagine the courage it took to accept that challenge to debate on public television in that condition. It's another respect in which she's a hero as far as I'm concerned. President Kennedy directed his President's Science Advisory Council to take up the questions raised by the book, and in 1963, they issued their report validating her findings. The day after the report came out, Senator Ribicoff began hearings by the Senate Committee on Environmental Hazards, and Rachel Carson came to testify. Her health, which seemed to have been on a bit of a rebound, such that she thought in February she might get back to her beloved cottage, declined rapidly. She died April 14th, 1964, at age 56. She had packed a lot into those last years. The End in the Beginning is a quote from Paul Brooks' book about Rachel Carson. His last section. We might have thought that once Silence Springs' truth was validated by a presidential council, the battle was won. Congress were looking into the issues, things would change quickly, but it was a slow process. It's hard for us to realize now that DDT had been approved by, of all things, the Food and Drug Administration. There was no EPA, no Clean Air Act, no Clean Water Act, no concept of endangered species, let alone their protection by federal government. All these things had to be imagined, coalitions built, legislation designed, legislators persuaded. Eventually they were. It took many people and organizations, but there's no question Rachel Carson's message prepared the way for that movement. Birds like bald eagles and peregrine falcons responded to the ban of DDT. Bald eagles went from a few dozen pairs in Maine in the 1970s to more than 800 pairs around the state today. It's a wonderful environmental success story that I personally enjoy every day. I almost never cross the bridge between Richmond and Dresden without seeing one, if not two, bald eagles. But there is still work to be done. Consider these grim facts. Thousands of new chemicals have been invented and are now in use. Over 1 billion pounds of pesticides are still used in the US every year. Over 45 million pounds used in the US are pesticides that are banned in other countries, excuse me. And then there's PFAS. It's not a pesticide, but a very similar problem. Persistent, water soluble, it bioaccumulates, and it's very toxic, even in very small doses. The difference I see is that PFAS is now getting attention and is being regulated. I don't see the same attention and regulation to the pesticides. In a speech to students at Scripps just a year before she died, she said to the graduating class, "Your generation must face realities instead of taking refuge in ignorance and evasion of truth. Yours is a grave and sobering responsibility, but also a shining opportunity. You go out into a world where mankind is challenged as it has never been challenged before to prove its maturity and its mastery, not of nature, but of itself." That could be perfectly apt to any graduating class today, however many decades later. Proving our maturity in how we govern ourselves, whether it be curbing the chemicals we use and put onto our lands and waters, or radically reducing carbon dioxide we add to the atmosphere, is going to be very hard work and often discouraging, especially these days. So I want to leave you with some of Rachel Carson's more hopeful reminders, the things that can give us strength to carry on these struggles. It's important to me. I know that my advocacy and do-goodism, if I didn't go for a walk outside every day, I wouldn't be able to do it. The last time I gave this talk, I ended with a slide, and I read a letter that Rachel Carson wrote about monarchs that seemed to be a perfect epitaph for her. But I'm not going to do that today. I think a more suitable tribute is to speak of action. So, with your permission, I'm going to speak very briefly about a particular group of insecticides that I think we could do something about. Neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, are a group of related insecticides that have been around for several decades and are used ubiquitously in agriculture, at least in the United States. About a decade ago, some European researchers linked their use to a sharp decline in flying insects and to declines in many bird species. Their evidence was so compelling that neonics were effectively banned in the EU, but they're still in very wide use in the US. Maine passed its first ever legislation regulating for neonics in 2021. This bill specifically prohibits only use for outdoor residential use, i.e. lawns and gardens. Doesn't prohibit the sale of plants grown using neonics, so please ask if you're shopping for perennials at Home Depot or Lowe's. Better yet, buy your native perennial plants from Maine Audubon, which are organic. This new Maine rule is important on two levels. Now you can be more sure you're not poisoning the pollinators you're trying to attract to your home garden, and it represents an unusual instance of passage of Maine regulations tighter than national standards. But it represents a tiny fraction of the amount of neonics being used in Maine. 5 years ago, I went to the State Bureau of Pesticide Control to review reports that are required to be submitted on anyone using pesticides. And it was fascinating. The majority of the reports were from golf courses. And I had no idea how many different kinds of sides, killing agents, golf courses use on all kinds of things, from algae to crabgrass to mice to snakes. If you're a golfer, start asking questions. The largest aerial extent of neonic application reported was on several commercial blueberry barrens. Another reason to buy organic. There are organic wild blueberry barrens in Maine. But wait, I thought, where are the reports from the big farms up in Aroostook County, like those that grow potatoes and broccoli? Oats. The answer I was told was that those farmers use neonics by treating the seeds before planting. And that use is not required to be reported because the EPA puts them under a treated article exemption. So it's an unregulated use. They're not reported. But consider this, a single neonic-coated seed contains enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees. And it's especially dangerous because 95% of the neonics in treated seed is not taken up by the plant to be ingested by any insect that chews, burrows, sucks, or pollinates, but stays behind in the soil, from which, of course, it runs off into the nearest water body. This is concerning because this way neonics are not only toxic to birds that might be eating some of that seed, but also to insects that breed in water, such as mayflies. And very likely it's linked to the dramatic declines in birds like swallows. You eat insects on the wing. This is not just about bees. And importantly, neonic treated seed doesn't actually improve yields. So what can we do about it? The EPA is currently reviewing the registrations for all neonicotinoids. When the EPA, they've been saying this for years, when the EPA posts its draft ruling in the Federal Register, which is anticipated to be in this year, we can write in comments, register our concerns, demand at the very least treated seed be classified as a restricted use that must be reported. Better idea would be to simply ban them. But I recognize that this is not likely to happen under the current administration. So there are things we can do as a state. 10 states have restricted the use of neonics, but most do not address the largest issues. However, Vermont recently joined New York State in banning most outdoor uses of neonics, notably including the treated seed of cereal crops. Quebec is using an innovative approach, saying you can't use neonic-treated seeds for corn and soybean crops unless you obtain a need-based prescription from an independent agronomist. Well, guess what? Use is plummeted in Quebec as a result. In other words, they couldn't pass the need-based test. Maine could pass legislation using Vermont, New York, and Quebec as models. But I realize it would take a commitment of years to build a coalition, to educate both public and agriculture industry, and probably not likely to rise as a priority for Maine's environmental organizations in the near future because they'll be so busy fighting defense against rollbacks of federal environmental protections. But I think we can start with education. That's what I'm trying to do here tonight. So here are some additional resources if you're interested in learning more, besides, of course, reading Rachel Carson's own books, which I highly recommend. I drew heavily on The House of Life by Paul Brooks. Paul had been her agent, editor, and friend, and he and his wife were also the people who adopted Roger when Rachel died. Then there's Always Rachel, The Letters of Rachel Carson and Dorothy Freeman, edited by Martha Freeman of Maine. It's really a remarkable collection. The Monarch letter that I didn't read is on page 467, so you can go find it in the library and get that wonderful letter. Finally, A Sense of Wonder, a one-woman play about Rachel Carson, written and performed by Kailani Lee, which is best seen live, and she does still do performances, but it's also available as a video documentary online. And here's some resources about neonics, 3 good places to start. Scott Weidensall is was my co-editor on the Birds of Maine. He's a writer of many, many books about birds, but he wrote an article called Neonic Nation in Living Bird, which is the magazine of the Cornell Lab. It's really terrific. I reread it this afternoon, was impressed all over again. American Bird Conservancy has a report, a neonic report, online at abcbirds.org. I looked at that this afternoon, also reminded myself, very comprehensive, harder to read, frankly, than Scott Weidensall's, but if you really want to delve into it and get citable links, it's the way to go. It's a little bit more academically written. And then there's Xerxes Society. Xerxes Society is an organization dedicated to conservation of insects, and they have some great pages on neonics. And as you can see here, I particularly called out their page on what we can learn from Quebec's success with regulating pesticide-treated seed. It's a great story. And if anybody's interested, you can contact me, and there's my contact information. And I have a 2-page list of additional resources about neonics. So I am ready to answer questions, Ed, if we've got time.
Well, we do have time, Barbara, and thank you very much. This was fantastic. I'll remind folks that this is recorded, and I'll thank Martin McDonough, who's our tech coordinator on this. He should have this up on our website here in a few days. I don't see any questions in the chat zone here, Barbara, but if people want to take a couple minutes, I have a question around neonics. Just, do you know what the involvement is with MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association? I know they're, very anti-pesticide. Are they working in particular on trying to get some legislation entered and maybe passed? Do you know?
Not that I know of. I reached out to them a couple of years ago, and there wasn't much happening, and I should have looked at their website before I got on the Zoom this afternoon, and I forgot, quite honestly, but that's a good question, and it would be worth reaching out to MOFGA.
Yeah,
They
certainly.
would be a logical lead for this, but on the other hand, MOFGA in general, I think, takes the attitude of let's us do what we do well, which is good. And we all should be buying from people who are certified by MOFGA, but less about telling the other farmers what they should and shouldn't be doing.
Mm.
I can see that could be tough for them.
Yeah, I think I've seen plenty in their newspaper and so forth over the years on neonics and certainly pesticides in general. And I mean, they are active, or they were active legislatively. I don't know how active they are these days, but
Yeah.
Good point. I would say, what you just said, I would think of the Maine Farmland Trust. They don't really care as long as it's farming. It doesn't really matter. But MOFGA's been pretty good over the years. So anyway, still don't see any chat things going
Somebody
on.
has to do is unmute themselves and speak up.
You can do that too. Well, I don't know if Martin has to control that, but
Hi, I'll unmute myself. And thank you so much, Barbara. I'm I'm a Rachel, and of course, I'm a big Rachel Carson fan. I try to read Silent Spring in March every year when it's spring. And I just wanted to say that Friends of the Earth, they have a lot of good information on their website about neonics and pollinators and which products to look for, you know, and some good visuals on that. I think if I can, I'll see if I can put the link in the chat. But
Okay,
thank you again. I really, this is inspiring me to do more. So thank you so much.
thanks. Good. Ed, could you stop? Would you share your screen so that my screen isn't being shared anymore?
Yes. Right.
So I see Jeanette looks like she's unmuted herself. Jeanette, do you have a question?
Yes, I did. And I'd like to just also thank you very much for this talk. I've been a fan of Rachel Carson since I was a small child, actually, and love rereading her books. A couple things. One, I just found this book called Deep Water that I have also reminds me of Rachel Carson. This is by a British author. Anyway, I put it up here for anybody who's interested. And the other thing I want to just let you know is that there's a growing group of people in Topsom who are interested in working on the pesticides issue. And I am going to pass your webinar on to them because I think it would be a great resource for them since you've already gone over this ground and have some background in it. So I appreciate it. Just a big thank you.
I would love to be put in touch with them. Thank you.
Yeah, and Angie Brewer is on their conservation commission, and she and I met about that. They're looking for ways to sort of take a more proactive role on clean water, certainly, or on water monitoring, and they are interested in particular on the pesticide issue. So that would be great. I have her contact information. I can certainly share with you.
Well,
She
that's
works
good.
she works for DEP in her day job.
Ah, good. Well, I somebody asked me why I had chosen this particular thing to be an advocate about, and I have to explain to people that I'm on the board of environmental protection, and as such, I have to be careful about what I advocate about publicly because I don't want to get into a position where I have to recuse myself on some issue that comes before the board to be voted on. But the Board of Environmental Protection does not govern pesticides, and so I can speak up about this freely. Defend our health. Okay.
Paul Berry has a question. Are you aware of any legislators in particular, who are expressing an interest in neonics and presumably other pesticide issues, Barbara?
I'm not.
Okay.
If I'd love to hear Paul's question, but he needs to unmute himself.
Well, that was the question.
Oh,
He was asking if you knew of any legislators that
yeah.
had a particular interest in neonics.
Yeah. Well,
I'll mention that I'm having a senior moment, but years ago, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay with the Maine Toxics Action Coalition circulated a really well done book that I think was called In Harm's Way, something to that effect. It's published by the Boston Physician for Social Responsibility, and it is totally focused on the effects of chemicals and pesticides, largely on children. And we made sure that that went out to every family practitioner in the state, every pediatrician in the state, every neurologist in the state, every OBGYN practitioner in the state, and the libraries all around the Bay. And
wow.
I recently looked that up, and it's now available as a PDF. And I've actually posted it in our library. It's probably in the chemical section,
Mhm.
but I don't remember where it is. But it's chemical or chemical or miscellaneous probably.
Yeah.
So it's a very good resource, and they have since published a few companion pieces that are a little bit more focused. So that might be worth a look.
Good.
So
Thank you.
new chat, maybe. someone mentioned, Janet Davis mentioned, Defend Our Health is also working hard on these issues, on PFAS legislation.
Well, I think, I mean, it's appropriate, of course, that PFAS is getting all the attention right now, but that also means that it's hard for people to carry these, multiple things at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think while we're doing a bunch of PFAS work, and we've done a lot of the chemical pesticide work, pesticide in schools work years ago, that PFAS is kind of the chemical du jour, and the other ones are still out there and still bad and still deserving of a lot of attention.
Right. So I think we probably need to wrap this up, but I just would end by saying, as citizens, as consumers, there is a lot we can do, and I think that buying organic is absolutely the first one we should start with. I heard a talk given by a representative of the Department of Agriculture about pollinators, and the person failed to say why it would be useful if people bought, she didn't include in her list of actions that one could take, buy organic vegetables, buy organic plants, which I thought was shocking because it's the basic. The other thing I wanted to mention is that things like neonics, and I'm sure it's true of others, are in all kinds of things that get exempted from these rules. For instance, flea shampoo for dogs. Who would think that there are neonics in flea shampoo? But there are, and that means that when you wash the dog with the flea shampoo, chances are the soapy water is going down a drain somewhere. And what they found is that it ends up, you can find neonic traces in water bodies all over the place where there's no agriculture nearby at all. There are just people using products like flea shampoo, and it's amazing. So
Yeah, and that's true with a lot of substances we buy. There'll be, if you look at the ingredients, there'll be an active ingredient, and it'll list, one or two things maybe, but then there's like, 95% inert ingredients, but those are not necessarily chemically inert or, safe. They are oftentimes harmful, but they are just not the active one. And so as inert ingredients, they don't need to be listed. So I really do encourage everyone, for what it's worth, to read ingredients if you don't already when you buy things. So thank you very much, Barbara. That was really wonderful. I really appreciate you doing this. And thank you, Martin, again. And thank you all for coming. And this will be online within a few days, hopefully. And hope to see some of you next month, second Wednesday of each month, October through May. You saw the schedule, you know where we live. So thank you all, and stay warm tonight, and buckle up for the next few years.